The next one, is this a more high context culture or a more low context culture? If it's a more high context culture, communication is very heavy on the nonverbal. And what this means, and the part you need to remember, is that there's an assumption made about how to communicate with someone based on their title, their role, their place in society, an assumption made about how you communicate with that person. Relationships are important. You would want to get to know a person before you did business with them, for instance. Because the identity is rooted in groups. Rather than being an individual identity, your identity is more rooted in the group you're associated with. And this, for instance, someone who is going to approach you, make contact with you, they will look at you as being a member of a certain group, and their communication with you would be led by that, rather than seeing you as an individual. Also, coincidentally, a high context culture expects to have centralized authority. There's someone at the top. It's a hierarchy. Main thing to remember about a high context culture is that there are assumptions made based on a person's role in the society. Who they are, what group they belong to, what their title is, that type of thing. Now let's look at the other end of this continuum. A low context culture. A low context culture, you're approached as an individual. There are no assumptions based on who you are, what group you belong to. No assumptions made about what you already know. Incidentally, it's interesting that in a low context culture, relationships tend to begin and end quickly, but that's secondary to the fact that a low context culture, you're seen as more of an individual. I can't assume things about you because you're different than everyone else. So I would have to spell things out. I can't make any assumptions about what you already know, for example. Okay, so there's also a link here at the bottom to a video that explains in a little more depth what high context versus low context is. Now, is it any surprise that high context cultures tend to be collectivist cultures and low context cultures tend to be individualist cultures? No surprise when you look at the qualities, is there, of each? Another dimension that we look at in determining cultural differences is, does this culture tend to be more of a masculine or more of a feminine culture? You need to know that this has nothing to do with how many men or how many women in the culture. All we're talking about here is masculine qualities that are associated as masculine qualities and how they translate into values in the culture, and some qualities that tend to be recognized here as feminine cultures and how they apply to values in the culture. So let's look at the masculine culture. In a more masculine culture, material strength and success are valued. Ambition and competition is expected. Those are valued. Those are expected of people. On the other hand, in a more feminine culture, there are different expectations of people. People are expected to, there's more of a concern for the relationships between people and the quality of life of people. And it's more important to be polite, rather competitive or ambitious, that kind of thing. More caring about people versus having power, being ambitious and competitive. As we go through these, one way to think of this is think about the United States. Where does the United States fall on each of these continuums? And we'll probably talk some more about that in class. Interestingly, is it no surprise that a more masculine culture tends to be a more individualist culture, and a feminine culture tends to be more collectivist? Probably no surprise there. The next one is pretty straightforward. This dimension asks, is the culture more of a high power distance culture or a low power distance culture? Well, a high power distance culture, and you can think of this as there's a high amount of distance between people in power and people out of power, not in power. So a high power distance culture, the government, the leadership is in the hands of a few. Everyone else is expected to be respectful of that authority, and you are not to speak up. That is looked at negatively. There is someone at the top, you do what they say. That's the high power distance culture. At the other end of that spectrum is the low power distance culture. Now, in a low power distance culture, free speech is valued, people are viewed relatively equally, and you'd be expected to be assertive and to speak up regardless of the power of the person when you disagree. There's another link for a video here at the bottom of the page also. Let's look now at whether a culture is high ambiguity tolerant or low ambiguity tolerant. And it might be easier to think of this as high change tolerant or low change tolerant. If you just wanted to, in your head, substitute the word change for ambiguity. So, what are the qualities of a high ambiguity or high change tolerant culture? Well, uncertainty is expected. Things can change. There aren't a lot of rules of communication because people are different. People do things differently. Things can change. Here's a good example. Students in a high ambiguity tolerant culture, they expect the professor, to give assignments, and they have to figure out. They might be more vague. They can question the professor. The professor, they understand, doesn't necessarily know all the answers. They can question him. This doesn't mean there's no respect, of course, but the realization is that things change. We're all individuals. Now let's look at more cultures that are more low ambiguity tolerant, low change tolerant. These are cultures where, okay, we want to avoid uncertainty. There's one way of doing things. The professor's the authority. If he doesn't know, what's he doing teaching me? Parts to remember in this is that a low ambiguity tolerant culture, there's one way of doing things. It's very tradition oriented. Uncertainty is to be avoided. For instance, here's a good example. If your grandfather owned the general store in town and your father took that store over, well, in a low ambiguity tolerant culture, you are expected to take over that general store from your father. What? You're not going to? Well, that's not good. That's no way to do things. So, which of these do you think the United States tends to be? And it shows it right at the bottom there. But it's pretty evident that we're a high ambiguity tolerant culture in general. Now let's think about time for the next dimension. We can ask, is the culture more long-term oriented or short-term oriented? If it's more long-term oriented, then the future rewards are worth waiting for. We're doing today, we might have some unpleasantness or today, but the future rewards is what are really of value to us. So we'll put up with something today for the long-term outcome. On the other hand, if it's more of a short-term orientation, we live for the day. Immediate rewards is where it's at. Now, none of these dimensions, like I said, no culture is completely one way or completely the other way, but cultures do tend to be more one than the other. The last dimension we'll look at is the culture more indulgent or more restrained? And a culture that's more indulgent looks at enjoying life, might be spending more money, a little bit more live for the day, just enjoy life. Now, coincidentally, people who live in a more indulgent culture tend to feel that they have more control over one's life. People in a restrained culture, the values are, oh, I have to be careful. I don't want to have too much fun because I need to save money for a rainy day for the future. I need to do this so that I will have a better tomorrow. Coincidentally, people in a more restrained way of thinking, a more restrained enculturation, they don't feel that they have as much control over their lives. There might be more saving of money in this culture, that kind of thing. So it's really hard on this one to tell where the United States would fall. What do you think? If we look at family cultures, we can certainly probably think of our own family perhaps, and whether our family culture tends to be more indulgent or more restrained, or maybe we're right in the middle. Human beings draw close to one another by their common nature, but habits and customs keep them apart. Intercultural communication is communication between persons of different cultural backgrounds. You're undoubtedly going to be in this situation sooner or later. I'm sure that you probably have been in this situation in some way. Certainly, if we look at cultures as not just country cultures, but family cultures, religious cultures, urban versus rural cultures. And it's another way of looking at culture is to realize that communication originates from a specific cultural context. We're conditioned by the culture that we're used to interacting in, used to living in, and we receive everything through that little filter of culture. Other people have that same little cultural shell on them so that everything they receive from you is understood and evaluated with their culture, uh, partly by their culture. If you recall back in Chapter 3, we talked about some of the elements, factors that can play a role in our interpretation and evaluation of what we perceive. And one of those is our own particular culture. It's also important to remember that culture is just one of three dimensions that can drive human behavior and how we communicate. There are certain universal things that humans experience, the universal refers to ways in which all people and all groups are the same. Cultural, of course, refers to what a particular group of people have in common and how they differ from other cultural groups. And then there's the personal. There's always the personal because we are individuals. The personal describes the ways that each of us is different from everyone else. Think about some universal qualities that all human beings have. Think about some personal differences between people, even within the same culture. All of these three influences contribute to our unique behavior and ways of communicating. Now, here's another example of enculturation. Sex is the biological distinction. We don't learn how to be a sex, but gender is the role you learn through enculturation. We learn to be a gender. Here are some ways to improve intercultural communication. When you come into contact with a person or people from a different culture, or you are in a situation where you are perhaps the outlier, the person who's going into a new culture, here are some ways you can prepare for that. You might want to learn about the other culture before the experience if you have a chance to. Reduce ethnocentrism. What is ethnocentrism? Well, ethnocentrism is believing that your culture is the best one. Your culture is really the way everyone should do it. Probably not going to help you get along with people from other cultures if that shows. You know, you might think it, I know, but showing that to people probably isn't going to make friends and influence people. So I just think about that before the experience of interacting with people from another culture. Confront stereotypes. Think, do I have a stereotype about these people? I probably shouldn't show that or act on it because stereotypes can certainly be wrong. Most of the time they are. Increase mindfulness. This book uses the word mindfulness a lot, but really, mindfulness is just being aware and thinking about something before you do or act. Recognize differences. Adjust your communication accordingly. And recognize that you might have culture shock. We're not going to put a lot of emphasis on culture shock, but culture shock is when everything is so different that it's a freaky feeling. You don't know what to do. Realize that you might have to take it little steps at a time. All of these are ways to help you navigate in a different culture or with people from a different culture.